All right, so that's a warning that it's being recorded. All right, let me go to attendance here and let's see who's here and who's not. Business Law 2. Okay, Nevaeh Arnold. Nevaeh. Okay. Sydney Babel.
Here.
All right. Jacob Blackburn.
Here.
Okay. Matthew Castles.
Here.
Okay. Grace Sicky.
Here.
All right. Madeline De Palma.
Here.
Josh Grigoletti.
Here.
Great. Jeremy Groves.
Here.
Okay. Travis Harvey.
Here.
Sydney Hips. Okay. Seiyun Huang.
Here.
All right. Kayla Jewell.
Here.
Okay. Christian Kemp.
Here.
Okay. Yuta Koike.
Here.
Okay. Destiny Merriweather.
Here.
Okay. Jeremy Meyer. Jeremy. Okay. Brock Newsom.
Here.
Okay. Anthony Phillips.
Here.
Haley Phillips.
Here.
Jacob Smeltzer.
Here.
Walter Tolliver. Walter. Okay. Hallie Vogt.
Here.
Okay. Autumn Wanchik. Autumn? No.
I'm here.
There you are. Okay. May Williams.
Here.
Okay. Ashley Wolford.
Here.
All right. That's attendance. All right. Let me get my book up and running here. Turn on my keyboard. All right, today we're going to be talking about checks and fund transfers. I think this is a pretty fun chapter, actually. Let me clear this. And let me get to the first page. All right. I have a cup of coffee sitting over there. I'm going to go get. All right, so I'm back. So let's see, let's take a look at the outline for today, and I'll share that so that we can all look at it together at the moment to see what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So chapter 30, checks and fund transfers. The nature of a check. Is it payable on demand or at a specific time? The form of a check. Additional types of check: money order, cashier's check, teller's check, substitute check, certified check. Presentment. Time for the presentment of a check. When is a check no longer any good? Dishonor of a check, overdraft, a stale check, stop payment orders, what you can do with your bank. Wrongful dishonor, what happens if the bank wrongfully dishonors your check. Encoding warranty, bank liabilities for checks, premature payment of a post-dated check, payment over a stop payment order, payment over a forged signature of the drawer. Time for reporting forgery or alteration, there's a 40-day rule. Consumer fund transfers, electronic fund transfers, ATM, pay by phone, direct deposit withdrawal, POS terminals, internet banking. And then consumer liability for EFT card loss, electronic fund transfer card losses. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. And that's warm. Good. All right, let me get back to my book. All right, so we're going to talk about basically checks today, and checks are the historical way that we used to pay our bills and transfer money. If somebody needed some money from me, if one of my kids wanted, hey, Dad, can I borrow $100? generally I wouldn't have $100 in cash. I could write them a check. If I wanted to pay my electric bill, I would write a check. If I wanted to make a mortgage payment, I would write a check. If I wanted to go grocery shopping, I would write a check. Checks are very old in the commerce system that we have. They've been around for quite a while. We have now moved towards a economy that seems to thrive on electronic fund transfers, but everything is still built on the system that we have to cash checks. So I want to tell you basically how a check goes through the payment system. Okay, now I'll write a check, and I'm going to do this again where I write a check to one of the students right before spring break. So I write a check to Sally Smith for $100. And I give that check to Sally, and she doesn't have time to negotiate it before she leaves for spring break. So she takes the check with her, and let's say that she is from California, specifically San Francisco. So she goes to San Francisco, and we go through that same process that we saw before, that she wants to cash the check, but she doesn't have a local bank there. So she negotiates it to her mother. Her mother, excuse me, gives her the $100, and then her mother takes it to the bank and deposits it to her account. Okay, now, keeping in mind that I had told you that the banks don't necessarily want to ever be in a position where they have to eat the cost of a check that is dishonored. So when my check, which is going to be drawn on a bank here in the eastern part of the country, is going to be put into the banking system in the western part of the country, there's not a lot of confidence that the check will necessarily be cashed, will be honored, excuse me. So what the banks will tend to do is they're going to want to not give you cash for it. In the old days, what they would do is they would tell you that you could put it into an account, and in 5 days or 3 days, depending on your bank and what your relationship with the bank was, they would make the cash available to you, say 3 days later. That is because the bank is concerned that when they put it through the banking system, it's not going to be honored. That way, if the bank finds out, if the check is dishonored and it's returned to the bank in San Francisco, they will just give a notice of dishonor to the customer of theirs that deposited the check, take the money back out of their account. They'll give the bad check back to the depositor. And then it's up to the depositor to try and look for secondary sources to pay the check. Okay, we talked about that under liabilities and warranties and whatnot of endorsers and such. That's why the banks act the way they do. And one of the reasons was that back before the advent of electronic movement of money, the check was a physical document that physically moved through the payment system. So that check that I gave to Sally Smith, that she negotiated to her mother, who deposited it into the First Bank of California. When the First Bank of California gets it, they give credit for the $100 to Sally's mother. Okay. However, the bank, knowing that they have the ability to get the money back if they have to, because the mother's a depositor, right? What will happen is the bank would then batch their check transactions for the day, and they would go through something called a clearinghouse and proof. Let me see something, if I can show you. Let me see. I'm looking through the chapter here. I'm looking for an illustration. Of course, not going to be there. All right, so everybody knows what a check looks like, right? It's going to be, it could be about this big, it could be bigger. There's no real standardization to what a check has to be as far as size and things like that. But they're generally going to be rectangular in shape, just because that's easier to go through our system of handling pieces of paper. I thought there would be a picture. There's not. All right, so everybody picture a check. Okay, so it's this rectangle. Up in the upper right-hand corner, generally there's going to be a pre-printed check number. That's so we can keep track of our checks for reconciliation and identification purposes. The upper left is going to have pre-printed generally the name of the depositor, who owns the account. In my case, it would be John Gamalchak, and it would have my address. Below that, when you get to about the center of the page, there are the words printed that says pay to the order of, and then there's a long blank line. Then there's a box at the end of that line. It has a $sign at the beginning of the box, and the rest of it is empty. Okay. Now, once again, there was the magic language pre-printed on the check, pay to the order of, right? That makes it negotiable, right? Because of the fact that it has that negotiability language, pay to the order of. So whoever I make that check payable, on that long line, I'll write in the name Sally Smith. So now the document, which is eventually going to become a negotiable instrument, is negotiable, pay to the order of, that's negotiable language, but it's also turning it into what we refer to as order paper, because it's paid to the order of a specific person, Sally Smith. The box at the end of that line that has the $sign, that's where we write in Arabic numerals the amount of the check. So there'll be $sign already pre-printed. I will put a 1, a 0, a 0.00, making it $100. The line below that is another blank line that runs all the way across the check, and that is where you are supposed to write in words the value of the check. So I would write in ONE space HUNDRED space and 00 over $100. And then I would make a little squiggly to the end of the line because I don't want anybody to alter my document. Below that, on the left-hand side, you're going to have a spot where it says memo, and there's a little line there. Not entirely required for this to be a negotiable instrument. That's for your own accounting records to keep track of why you wrote the check. Turns out that I had lost a bet to Sally Smith, and I'm going to write in there, pay off losing bet. On the right-hand side, there's another line where it'll have the line where I sign it. As the drawer on the check, I'm required to sign it to make it valid, to turn it into a negotiable instrument. Oh, I did forget that up in the upper right-hand side, under where the pre-printed check number is, there'll be a spot for the date. Now, below everything, below the memo, below the line where I've signed, there are some strange characters that run along the bottom of your check, okay? They're numbers and other things like colons and dots and strange little characters. But the two pieces of information that are probably at the bottom of the check are what's called the bank routing number, which identifies the bank that the checking account is being held in. Okay, so if I do my banking at Citizens Bank of Pennsylvania, so Citizens Bank of Pennsylvania's routing number will be the first set of numbers on the bottom of my check. I hit the wrong button here on here. Then there'll be a space, and then there will be another set of characters, very likely that will be my account number at the bank where I have the account. Okay, so the first set of numbers is the bank identification number. They call the ABA number, American Banking Association number, or the routing number. And then the second set of numbers will be the account number for my bank. Now, I find it interesting. I have a bank account with Citizens Bank, which is a commercial bank, does a lot of interesting business worldwide. My wife has a checking account with a local small bank called Marquette Savings Bank. And my account number is, I think, 13 digits long. My wife's account number is 6 digits long, just because of the fact they have so many fewer customers. Then the rest of that particular line, well, the next thing on there will probably be the check number. So if it's like check 210, 210, then it'll say 210 in those characters that run along the bottom of the check. Now, the characters that are running along the bottom of the check, the bank ABA or routing number, the account number at that institution, and the check number are very important special type numbers. They're what are called microcoding, MICR. It stands for magnetic character ink recognition. Magnetic ink character MICR, magnetic ink character recognition. Because back in the days before we really had, you know, the ability to do a lot of optical scanning and whatnot, the way that we would have these pieces of paper be machine read, because see, we want them to be able to be read by the machine. We don't want people to have to be involved in every step of this process. What we want to be able to do is be able to make this a fast process. So they developed this magnetic ink. And so those numbers that are printed on the bottom of your check are in a special type of ink that can be read magnetically by the machines that the banking system uses, okay? So now this check can go through and be read by a machine, because when it goes through, the bottom of this check will sit in a slot as it slides along in a machine, and a machine can read, okay, this is the bank where this is being drawn. Okay, this is the account number where it's being drawn. Oh, this is the checking, this is the check number. Oh, there's no amount. So it's useless at this point, because the check has all the ability to identify where the account is and such, but we can't just put the check through the system and let the machines read it, because it can't read the amount, okay? So what the banking system has is a system where the amount of the check is imprinted on the bottom of the check in magnetic ink, okay? So it can be read with the magnetic ink character recognition system, okay? Now, how is that done? That is done by what I believe is probably the worst job in the world. One of the jobs that I had before I became a lawyer, when I was in the accounting world, is I was an internal auditor for First National Bank of Pennsylvania. And I got to see all of the various departments, because we basically audited everybody. You know, we audited all of the branches of the bank. We audited all of the departments of the bank. And the department that takes care of these checks is called proof. And what would happen in proof is there would be an employee that would be sitting inside of a machine. She was actually, and it was almost always a woman. Very few men. I think at least at that point in time, women were secretaries, and they had the ability to to punch the keys with very fast repetition and in a very accurate manner. There's nothing that says it has to be a woman. Just in my experience, it was almost always women in these jobs. But they would actually sit in this machine, and the checks would be dumped in a bin on the left side of the machine, and then the machine would then shake them down so that the checks would fall into a slot, and then they would be carried, and they would come at a very fast rate. So a check would run up in front of the woman who was sitting in the proof machine, and let's say that it's my $100 check to Sally Smith. She would then type in 100.00 send, and then the check would fly off over into another bin. Okay, so it was this person's job in the proof department to actually type in and have the machine put the magnetic ink on the bottom of the check with the proper amount of the check. Okay, this is probably the worst job in the world. These people were expected to have, I don't remember what the number of items that they were supposed to handle per minute was, but it was an ungodly large amount. We're talking about sitting for 8 hours inside of a machine where checks are just flying in front of you. You hit the numbers and you hit send, and the next one is there. It was just, in my mind, it was probably the worst job in the world. And they were held to the standards. If they were too slow, they would be fired. They were also held to standards for accuracy. So if you are typing in the wrong amounts, because nobody's ever going to look at the check again, whatever you put on the bottom in the magnetic ink is what is going to be read by the machines. So if you put in 1,000 instead of 100, that check forevermore as it goes through the payment system is going to have been written for $1,000. Obviously, that's going to create a problem when it is sent to be negotiated. We'll talk about that. But anyhow, that's what happens to the check at the bank that accepts the check. Okay, so now after it goes through the proof department, it's read by the bank's computers, and they know, oh, okay, here's a batch of checks that are local, and they would be sorted off to the side, and these are bank checks that are not local, and they would be sorted off to a different direction. The local ones would generally go into a local clearinghouse where the local banks would have the ability to swap the checks among themselves. Okay, and so what would happen is, since let's say that I had a local check as opposed to this check from across the country, that $100 check would go into the local bin. It would go to the local clearinghouse. It would then be handed physically to the bank that that where my account is located. There it would go through proof again so that it could be read, so that it could be then taken out of my account. Then it would be sorted and go into a physical bin where the check would reside for the rest of the month. Let's go to the fact that this was a national check that I wrote. I'm in Pennsylvania. The check was negotiated in California. So the check would then have gone through proof at the bank, would be identified as something that's not a local bank. It's not going to go through local proof. So then it would end up being sent to the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve, for those of you who are not aware of what the Federal Reserve is, it's the national bank. It's the nation's bank. Okay, it's what's referred to in economic and finance terms as the central bank of the United States. It's where we do all of our banking. Okay, so my check that was drawn on a Pennsylvania bank that was negotiated in California would then be given to the Federal Reserve. There is a Federal Reserve branch in San Francisco, so it would be delivered to the Federal Reserve in San Francisco. It would go through proof again. And I believe there are 12 branches of the Federal Reserve. I could be wrong on that, whatever the number is. Let's just say there's 12. It would be sorted then into which of the Federal Reserve branches my bank reports to. So then after it would go through proof at the Federal Reserve in San Francisco, it would then be sent to the Federal Reserve Bank branch in Cleveland. And I know there's a sub branch in Pittsburgh, but let's stay with Cleveland for the moment. So now my check has physically been driven from San Francisco to Cleveland, where it goes through the proof system again, where it's read by the machines. And in Cleveland, they know they have a bin, if you will, so they'll sort the checks into each individual bank that reports to that Federal Reserve branch. So now my check would go through proof in Cleveland, and it would go into a batch for Citizens Bank. Those checks would then physically be presented to Citizens Bank at their operations center. It would then go through proof one more time, where it would be read, and now my bank would realize, okay, Gamalchak wrote a check. It was for $100. The computer, when it's going through proof, would look at my account. Hey, does Gamalchak have that $100 in there? Oh, he does. Okay, deduct the $100 and put that check into the bin that's got Gamalchak's name on it. See, in the old days, we got our checks back. They physically went to wherever they went, and they were physically returned to us. So at the end of the month, when you were doing your reconciliation of your bank account, you got in the envelope the statement that showed the transaction on your account, the beginning balance, transactions, pluses and minuses during the month, and then your final total. And then you got all of the checks back after they had gone on their trip around the country. Okay. That was an interesting system. It was a beautiful system. I kind of liked it. It was nice having those checks back because you could check for alterations. You could actually look at the physical check as it had come back to you. You could look at the endorsements on the back to see what bank the person that you had sent the check to was using to negotiate the check. A lot of information you could glean from the physical check that you got back. Then the terrorists took down the World Trade Centers on September 11th, 2001. Now, I know that this is a historical thing for you guys. I was alive. I was living through that. I was working. Where was I working at that time? I was a lawyer. I had my law office open at that time. And I had friends that were in the banking business because I used to be in the banking business. And the towers come down. The world comes to a stop. Now, one of the things that you probably don't realize unless you're a history buff or you're very into economics, the reason that the terrorists decided to target the Twin Towers in Washington, or excuse me, in New York City, was, yes, they were a iconic view of the United States economic might. You know, those towers were put up theoretically to represent the Rockefellers and their influence on the economy of the United States. But you know, even though they were a representation and it was a blow that was to try and cause us to lose all hope, the reality of it is that that was the heart of the payment system in the United States. A great deal of the physical paper that was currently in process in the United States at that moment was in one of the two towers. When the towers collapsed, a day, 2 days, 3 days, maybe even 5 days worth of the payment system of the United States was destroyed. Most people don't realize that that was basically a crippling attack on the payment system in the United States. Now, remember, you know, we have certain rules. You know, there's the holder in due course rule, because we're more interested in protecting the system than we are the individual sometimes. Now, the system was what was under attack, and so the payment system using the physical checks, you know, most people don't realize this, but the financial world came to a halt, at least in the United States, for a short period of time. The Federal Reserve did its best to try to recreate what was going on, what was in the system. They, of course, did have computers that had memory and whatnot, but you know, there were certain transactions that were lost because they weren't backed up. We all know about backups on our computers and whatnot. Think back to 2001 and what computers looked like in 2001. It was a much bigger deal. So the Federal Reserve was able to reconstruct the payment system, at least for the transactions that had occurred. Some were lost, I'm sure. All of the physical pieces of paper that were in the Twin Towers were destroyed. It interrupted the payment system with a very serious way. So the government decided that we needed to change the way that the payment system worked, because we did not ever want to be susceptible to that kind of attack again. So Congress passed something called Check 21. Which was to, and I don't know what the anachronism, you know, what the letters stand for, but basically it was to revolutionize and modernize the payment system in the United States, going away from relying on the physical pieces of paper, the physical checks that were, you know, that were lost in the attack. What the changes did was to remove the reliance on the physical document. So now I write that check to Sally Smith. She's got that piece of paper. She goes to California, negotiates it to her mother. Her mother then deposits it into her bank in California. Her bank, this is where the system changes. Her bank puts it through proof. But instead of doing the magnetic character ink character recognition on the bottom of the check is now scanned by the computer. A picture is taken of the front and back of the check. This is now what's called a substitute check because it's not the physical document, but now it's an electronic version of that physical document. And then the physical document is destroyed. Yeah, the bank in California would then destroy the physical check that I wrote in Pennsylvania. In the old days, I would physically get that check back in my statement at the end of the month. But now, since the government doesn't want to rely on pieces of paper anymore, it's destroyed, and the check substitute, the electronic version of it, the scanned version of the front and back, now has become the actual document. So when I've been talking about in various things over the past, 8, 9 months, whatever it's been, 6 months, 8 months, when I talk about the fact that the law has changed to move away from requiring the physical document, so it's no longer the writing, it's now the record. This is a very good example of that. We've gone away from relying on the physical piece of paper that was the check, and we're now relying on the electronic version of it that has been saved in the computer at the Federal Reserve or at the local bank. So now what happens is, instead of the physical check being presented to the Fed, the electronic version of the check is electronically transmitted to the Federal Reserve in San Francisco, who then batches it and immediately turns around and transmits it electronically to the Federal Reserve branch in Cleveland, who then immediately batches it, turns it around, and electronically submits it to my bank in Pennsylvania. Okay, now, under the old system, it would take approximately 5 days for a check to come across the country. And I used California as an example because I wanted it to be as far away geographically as I could go. So if the check under the old system was presented and negotiated in California, it would not be back into my checking account actually being presented against my checking account for probably 5 days, because it had to physically move across the country, move from the branch bank to the central bank of that bank, go through proof, be presented, physically transported to the Federal Reserve in San Francisco, physically trucked across the country to Cleveland, and then physically trucked from Cleveland to my bank, and then mailed. Then when it's finally presented to my bank, then the money would come out of my account. So if I wrote the check on day 1 to Sally Smith, she then presents it, say, to her mother for negotiation on day 3 because she had to get back to California during spring break, and her mother deposits it on day 4, and it takes 5 days for the Federal Reserve to actually present it to my bank. We're talking about 9 days after I created a check before it's actually presented and the money comes out of my account. Okay, I had made the statement, I think, at the end of last class, that we've lost something in the payment system called float. And that's what float was. Float was the fact that I knew that I had $100 less in my checking account than the bank did, because I knew I wrote that check to Sally Smith. But I also knew that Sally Smith was going to cash the check or negotiate the check in California. So I knew I had at least 5 days before that would hit against my account. Okay, so in economics, you talk about the money supply, and the money supply is much greater than the amount of currency that is in the economy. The money supply is all of the things that are money that are not cash, in addition to the actual currency, the cash that's out there. This is one part of the money supply, this float, because see, I got to use that $100 in reality, for 9 days after I spent it, I gave the check to Sally Smith. From an accounting point of view, I don't have that $100 anymore, but it hasn't come out of my bank. So I had 9 days of $100 worth of float. If I wanted to do some short-term transactions that I didn't have the money for, then as long as they were under $100, if I spent another $100 somewhere, that would be fine, because that $100 of Sally Smith's is still sitting in my account, as long as I was able to replace it before the check was presented 9 days from now. Okay, so in today's world, with everything being submitted electronically, the amount of time that it takes for a check to be presented, the amount of time that it takes for a check to be presented in California and then be presented to my bank in Pennsylvania, a day, 24 hours, maybe 36 hours. I guess it all depends on shifts and whether we're in a working day or banking day or not. But the reality of it is that once a check enters the payment system now, it's almost instantaneous that it's going to be presented to my bank. So float doesn't exist anymore. I guess it's kind of unethical spending the money that you've already spent. But hey, in the 80s and 90s, in the Wild West days of business, so we used to do all kinds of weird things. But anyhow, it doesn't exist anymore. Float has been taken off the table. But that was the big change in the that was the big change in the checking system, the payment system. Let me go back to the book and see what it is I should be teaching you, but that is what we have. All right, if we have a check, the drawee is always a bank, so we'll refer to the drawee bank. The check is drawn on the assumption that money is in the bank in order to cover the check. The check is payable on demand. The drawee bank only accepts checks through certification. If it's a draft, the drawee is not necessarily a bank. No assumption that drawee has any of the drawer's money to pay the instrument. The draft may be payable on demand or at a future date, and acceptance is required for liability of the drawer to attach. Okay, so those are different things. Let me take a look at the outline. So nature of a check, it's me giving a negotiable instrument that represents value, money that I have in account. It's payable on demand if it's a check. It could be at a specific time if it's a draft. We've gone over what a check looks like, what the form of a check is. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is types of checks, because we have different types of checks that we can use. Give me a second here. Okay. All right. So let's talk about certified checks, cashier's checks, and those types of things. Okay. In the order I have them on the outline is money order, cashier's checks, teller's checks, substitute check, and certified check. Let's start with a cashier's check, because that's the highest level, I think, of certainty. If I write you a personal check, there's no guarantee that you're going to get the money. The payment system exists. There's a way for you to negotiate that, to try and get the money out of my account. You have every right to the money that's in my account, but only if the money is in my account. So that's the problem of accepting a personal check. There's no guarantee that the money is going to be there when you present the check. One of the things we used to do in the old days is that somebody gave us a check and we were concerned about it. We would call the bank and ask if a check in a certain amount would cash. Now, the banks are not going to give you any kind of confidential information, but they would acknowledge whether or not the check would be good if it were presented at that moment. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be good when you present it later in the day or the next day. But at that particular moment, the bank would say, yes, we do agree that we would cash that check. Anyhow, a cashier's check is, I want a check from you, but I want a guarantee that it's going to be paid. So a normal check is drawn on my account at Citizens Bank. If you ask me for a cashier's check, what I have to do is I have to go to my bank. I would go to Citizens Bank, and I would I would talk to the teller, and I would say, listen, I need to have a cashier's check in the amount of $10,000. The bank would then look to see if I had that money in my account. Assuming that I do, they would say, sure, no problem, we can give you a cashier's check for $10,000. The first thing they would do is they would withdraw the $10,000 from my account, because they're not going to guarantee a $10,000 check and just let me have access to that money. So they would withdraw the $10,000 for that check from my account, so I would not have access to it anymore. They would deposit that $10,000 into the general fund of the bank. Then they would issue a check that is drawn on Citizens Bank. It's not drawn on my account at Citizens Bank. It would now be a check drawn on their account, on the bank's account. Basically, it's the entire value of the bank that is guaranteeing that check. Okay, so it moves from being a check that is being guaranteed by my account to a check that is being guaranteed by all of the assets of the bank. That's a cashier's check. Okay, a money order is very similar. If I go to the Citizens Bank and say, hey, I want a cashier's check for $100, they'd say, well, no, we're not going to give you a cashier's check for anything under $5,000. We'll give you a money order if you want. And I say, yeah, that's fine. That's what I kind of meant. So they would give me something called a money order. And basically it's the same thing. They take the money out of my account, it goes into a different account, and then whoever it is that's issuing that check, it's their credit and their account that is creating the credibility or the guarantee as to whether it's going to be cashed or not. So you can buy money orders in a lot of different places. If you didn't have the ability, I know one time I went to the DMV to get I don't remember what I was trying to get done at the DMV. And they said, we'll take a check, or no, they wouldn't even take cash. They would only take a check. They wouldn't even take any kind of credit card at the time. They only accepted checks. And it's like, I got a credit card here. I got a debit card. No, we don't take any of that. You have to have a check. Well, I do have to go home and get my checkbook and come back. No, you can go over to that gas station over there, go over to the country fair and buy a money order from them and bring that back, and we'll accept that. So a money order can be drawn against your bank. It could be drawn against anybody that's willing to issue one. So I went and got a money order from the country fair for, I think it was $7. I think what I was doing is I was getting my learner's permit for my motorcycle license, and I had to hand carry the money order back over to the DMV in order to satisfy their requirements. Now, was there any guarantee that that check was going to cash? Well, I guess it's the value of the country fair company that is guaranteeing that check as opposed to me. But that money order was not issued because they were worried about who was giving the check. It was mostly that was the only way they were accepting payments. Okay, that their money system was only set up to accept checks. They didn't want to pay the processing fees on credit cards, and they don't want to have cash around to be a temptation for their employees to steal. If you want to get a money order that is going to have a guarantee paid, get a money order from your bank. One of the interesting places you can go is you can go to the post office. The post office sells postal money orders. So once again, that's the government of the United States, basically, that you would be buying that cashier's check from. So, or excuse me, money order from. So it would be cashable. We have a teller's check that's listed out here. And the teller's check is where the, let's see what the book says about that. I'll be very honest with you. I'm not absolutely positive about that. Let me see where I can find that. I can't find it right now. My belief is that a teller's check is a check that you could have the bank write out for you. It's actually drawn against your account. In my world, it would be called a counter check, where you don't have a physical check, but you're in your bank. You need a check. You don't need cash. They would give you something that is in essence a total blank check, where it doesn't have any of the microencoding on it or anything. And you could put that through the system, but it would have to be microencoded with all of the information before it would enter proof. So that's a teller check. A substitute check is basically what we were talking about in the Check 21 system, where instead of having the physical check, a optical version of it was created and turned into a digital copy. That is a substitute check. In the electronic payment system, we can also refer to substitute checks. So for example, when I would go to a POS type situation where I give a check to the cashier at Walmart, and she puts it through her cash register, and it reads it and it turns it into an electronic version of the check that is immediately presented through the payment system, and then she hands me my check back. That POS electronic version of my check would also be considered a substitute check. The last one that's on the list here is something called a certified check. And once again, we're trying to deal with the fact that we have checks that are being used in a payment system. If you have confidence and a relationship with the person who's giving you the check, you probably just accept their personal check. And most of the time, a great majority of the time, the check is going to be valid. But if you're in a situation where you don't trust the other person and they want to give you a check, you could go the cashier's check method. You could go the money order method. One of the other things that's out there is something called a certified check. And what this means is that it's still going to be a personal check. You don't have the bank write you up a cashier's check where it's drawn directly on the bank itself. What you have is you have a personal check. I owe $10,000 to one of my vendors from my company, but they don't trust me and they want the check to be guaranteed to be cashed. I could get a cashier's check, I could get a money order, or I could have the check certified. What that would mean is I would make out the check for $10,000 to the vendor, whoever it was that I was paying, Acme Steel, and then I would take that check to my bank. It would be physically made out. It would have all of the blanks filled in on the check, payable to Acme Steel, today's date, whatever the check number is. My account number is, account name is on there. My account number is on there. All the microencoding is on there. I'd put the amount in, pay to Acme Steel, write it in words and whatnot, sign it. Check is ready to go. It's a negotiable instrument. It just hasn't been presented to anybody. It hasn't been delivered, okay? At this point, I would take it to the bank and I would say, my customer wants this to be certified. So much like the way they handle the cashier's check, the bank would then check to see if I had the money in my account. So it's $10,000. They'll look to make sure I have $10,000 in my account. They would verify, yes, I have $10,000 in my account. Then in the computer at the bank, they would put a hold on that $10,000. They wouldn't take it out of my account, but they would make it unavailable so that I would not be able to spend it on anything other than that certified check. Then they would stamp the check as being certified or accepted by Citizens Bank of Pennsylvania. Then I would send that check to my vendor, and when they presented it, it would go through the payment system, and then once it got to my bank, they would say, oh yeah, this is that check we certified for Gamalchak. They would then cash that check, so to speak, against the money that's in hold. And then that would release the hold, but then the $10,000 would be out of my account. Okay, so that's another way of making sure that we have the money in the account. It's all about trying to make sure that we actually have the money. Using the payment system, using checking. Sometimes you have to have a certain amount of faith, or you can force people to go into the banking system and get guarantees. All right, presentment is the next thing I have on the outline. Presentment is a formal request for payment on an instrument. That means that you have actually presented or taken or electronically submitted the check to the bank, the drawee bank, and asked for payment. So if that's a $100 check that I gave to Sally Smith, eventually it comes back to be presented to my bank, and at this point, it would be presented by the Federal Reserve asking for that $100, and that is presentment. Okay, presentment, formal request for payment on an instrument. Now, next item. Time for presentment of the check. Okay, which is where I thought we should be. How much time do you have in order to ask, to try and present this and get the bank to actually pay the money? Okay, under the UCC, presentment must be made within a reasonable time. Oh, don't you love those words? After the drawers and endorsers have signed the check. What constitutes a reasonable time is determined by the nature of the instrument, and blah blah blah. Failure to make a timely presentment discharges all secondary obligors. Understand that keep in mind all of the endorsements. Remember, anybody that has endorsed the negotiable instrument has made guarantees and has warranted that they will make the check good, or the instrument good, if it is dishonored. If you don't present in a timely manner, then what happens is all of those secondary endorsements and warranties, they go out of existence. So you lose that particular protection. The UCC establishes two presumptions as to what is a reasonable time for presentment of checks. If the check is not certified and is both drawn and payable within the United States, it is presumed that 90 days after the date of the check or the date of issuance, whichever is later, is the reasonable amount of time in which to make presentment for payment in order to attach secondary liability. Okay, so in order to maintain all of the warranties on a check, you must present it for payment within 90 days of the day that it was issued. With respect to attachment of the liability of an endorser, 30 days after an endorsement is presumed to be reasonable. So you have to be careful. Although the check will be able to be cashed or negotiated or presented for a period of time beyond this, after 90 days from date of issuance or 30 days after somebody else has endorsed it, you're going to lose those secondary guarantees. You want those secondary guarantees, okay? Okay, so that was the 90-day rule and the 30-day rule. All right, let's talk about dishonor. What does dishonor of a check mean? Dishonor. If the bank refuses to make payment, the drawer is then subject to the same secondary liability as the drawer of an ordinary draft. To be able to attach that secondary liability, the holder of the instrument must notify the drawer of dishonor by the drawee. The notice of dishonor may be written, or electronic. Time for notice, we know that if it's brought by a bank, it has to be by midnight of the day following the dishonor. Other people other than banks, it's 30 days after the instrument has been dishonored. Okay. Overdraft is another thing you can have out here. An overdraft is where your bank decides to pay the check even though you don't have enough money. Okay, so if I made that check payable to Sally Smith for $100, but my checking account only had $50 in it when it was presented, my bank could choose to pay the $100 check. If they do, what would happen to my account is my account would have a negative balance. Basically, the bank would be loaning me the money to cover that check. Now, you can set that type of thing up. Banks have what they refer to as overdraft protection, where they'll attach a like a savings account to your overdraft. So if you overdraft by $50 or whatnot, they'll grab the money out of your savings account in order to make the check good, or they will just plain old lend you the money until you put the money in to make your account a positive amount again. Now, the banks do this just because they're really wonderful people and want to make sure that they make everybody happy, and every time you do something like this, expect that you're going to be paying a fee. As a matter of fact, just about everything I talked about in this chapter, the bank will charge you for a fee. You want a cashier's check? No problem. If you got the money in your account, we'll give you a cashier's check. Oh, but we're going to charge you $13 to make that check. Oh, you want a money order? Not a problem. We'll still give you a money order as long as you have the money in your account. Oh, but we'll charge you $8 for the money order. Oh, you want to certify? You want that check to be certified? Not a problem. We'll certify that check. I've never had one physically done, so I don't know what the charge is, but I'm sure that it's going to be somewhere out there similar to a cashier's check or a money order. So anything that the bank does for you, they will charge you for that. The overdraft, or even if it's an NSF, if they reject and dishonor the check, they'll charge you for that. Overdraft fees are generally pretty expensive. Last time that I had one happen to me, I think it was like $35. So you know, it was an accounting error, and on my part, I thought I had more money in my account than I did. I didn't move the money from the one account to the other in time, ended up overdrawing. So it was like a $39 or something like that, but it's not cheap. Even if they decide to honor the check and it overdraws your account, makes it negative, they'll charge you that fee to do that. Okay. All right. Let's see what else we have here. Okay. Stale check and stop payment orders. Get back. Customer relationships, Patriot Act payment, stale checks. A stale check is a check whose date is longer than 6 months ago. Can you cash a check? Okay, so first off, we have a 90-day rule and a 30-day rule. 90 days after issuance, all of the secondary all the secondary payers are no longer responsible on the check. 30 days after a particular endorsement, that endorser is no longer responsible for the check. Now, can you cash a check? Can you negotiate a check beyond 90 days? Well, the answer is yes, because a check doesn't become stale until 6 months. A bank acting in good faith may pay a check presented more than 6 months after its date, commonly known as a stale check. But unless the check is certified, the bank is not required to do so. The fact that a bank may refuse to pay a check that is more than 6 months old does not mean that it must pay a check that is less than 6 months old, blah, blah, blah. You have to normal rules. So a check goes stale at 6 months. At 6 months, the bank can just say, you know what? We don't know why this check is so old and we think there's a problem with it, so we're going to refuse the check. They can dishonor a check that's more than 6 months old. Okay, because it's a stale check. Now, they may decide to honor it. It all depends on your relationship with your bank. Okay, so it's up to the bank as to whether they want to or not. What happens when somebody dies? If you die and you have checks that are outstanding, you know, once again, under the law, in theory, you no longer have the ability to enter into contracts, and negotiable instrument is a contract, but banks will tend to honor checks for a short period of time after the date of death of the depositor, usually around 10 days. All right, let's talk about stopping payment on a check. Stopping payment. I write a check and then I realize that, oh my gosh, I'm being scammed here. That is, you know, somebody's trying to steal my money. Can I stop that check? Is it possible for me to stop it? So what I could do is I could contact my bank and I could tell them, hey, there's a check out there that was obtained from me fraudulently, and I don't want you to honor it. I can tell my bank to stop it, stop payment on that check. Okay. 2 ways to do it. I can call my bank and do it orally. Okay, I can do that. Or I can do it in writing by filling out the appropriate paperwork at the bank. If I do it orally, just by calling my bank and telling them to do it, the stop payment order is only good for 14 days, 2 weeks. Okay, so if this is something that I think is going to be a short-term problem, I gave a check to a contractor and then he's refusing to do the work, I can put a stop payment on it orally, which will stop payment for 14 days. That'll get the contractor to come and talk to me. And I may not want to stop payment permanently because maybe the contractor is now going to behave himself. But if I think it's a pure fraud and I want the check to never, ever be cashed, then what I need to do is I need to do a written stop payment. I have to go to the bank and fill out their paperwork, and that gives me 6 months where the bank is ordered to not pay the check. Okay. What happens if the bank pays the check when they have been ordered not to? Well, then it becomes the bank's responsibility. The bank should make it up to the depositor. Okay, looking at the outline here. Wrongful dishonor. What happens if the bank dishonors a check when they really shouldn't have? Well, then what happens is the bank is going to be responsible to the depositor for any damages caused by their wrongful dishonor. Okay, so I write a check for $100 to Sally Smith. I have the money in the account. There's not a problem. It should have been cashed. It goes through the payment system. It's presented back to my bank by the Federal Reserve. My bank, for whatever reason, says, nope, we're not going to honor that check. So now that notice of dishonor goes back through the Federal Reserve, eventually gets back to Sally Smith's mother's bank, and they take the money out of Sally Smith's accounts. Now, first off, my bank is going to charge me $39 to dishonor that check. Then Sally Smith's mother's bank is going to charge, I think, around $15 to have a deposited item returned back. It has to go backward through the system. So there would be a charge there. And let's say that Sally Smith's mother, assuming that $100 was in the account, had written a check that now her check was dishonored and she had a $39 dishonor fee. So basically 39 times 2 is going to be 78 plus the 15, $88.93 of damages from the bank not properly just doing an improper dishonor. So the bank would be responsible for all of the damages that were created by them improperly dishonoring my check. Okay. All right. Encoding warranty. What do we got on that? Anything? Encoding warranty. A warranty made by any party who encodes electronic information on an instrument. A warranty of accuracy. Okay, so when the check goes through proof and the proof operator puts the wrong amount on the check, the bank is going to be responsible to make sure that everything is handled properly. I'll tell you the biggest example of this that I ever saw. When I was an auditor at First National Bank, we were approached by the security department because there was a proof error. A check was issued for, I think it was $100. And the proof operator, for whatever reason, must have had some sort of a hiccup in the middle of doing the typing of the numbers, put the check through for $100,000. Obviously, this was a very large depositor, and the check did actually cash for $100,000. It must have been one of the larger customers of a large business. And so the person who got the check, I don't believe they were a depositor at First National. They realized very quickly that the $100 deposit they were supposed to get actually ended up being $100,000. They went to their lawyer and said, what are my responsibilities here? And the lawyer said, your responsibility is to turn the money over once you're asked for it, and you're not required to do anything ahead of time. So they took the money and put it into a short-term investment, took it out of the bank so the bank couldn't just reverse the flow through the payment system. Put the money into some sort of a short-term CD. Once we figured out there was a problem, we could track down who the depositor was, and we approached them with all kinds of nasty threats and whatnot. They immediately cashed in the CD, gave us back the $999,900. That was $99,900 that was overpaid because they were indeed entitled to the 100. But they kept the interest. We turned around and our legal department wanted to take additional action against them, but in reality, we had no right to, because we were the ones that were the bad guys because we had screwed up the encoding, and under the encoding warranty, it was our responsibility to make it right. Bank liability for checks. I have premature payment of a post-dated check, payment over a stop payment order, payment over a forged signature of drawer. The bank has a very strong responsibility to do its job properly. Okay, a post-dated check is a check that I put the wrong date on purpose. Today is what, January 27th. I don't get paid until January 30th. So I give Sally Smith that check and say, hey, here's that check for $100, but don't cash it until the 30th because I don't get paid until the 30th. It won't be any good until then. So I write as the date on the check, today is the 27th, but I put on the check January 30th. In theory, making the check, the negotiable instrument, not negotiable until the 30th. Well, if Sally goes and cashes that, tries to cash that check, what the bank should do is they should say, well, wait a minute, this is post-dated. You can't cash this for another few days. But what happens if the bank actually does allow them to present the check and pay the check early? There's really no responsibility on the part of the bank here, unless I had notified the bank in advance that I was doing that post-dated thing, gave them all the information, including the check number, then they would be required to not pay the check until the proper date. The fact that I do it now and don't tell the bank makes no difference. Payment over a stop payment order, the bank has responsibility to make everything right. They have to give me the money back. Payment over a forged signature of drawer. Now, how many times do you think that they have a handwriting expert look at your check when it comes through the payment system? Every single check, right? Every single check, they have a handwriting expert and go, yeah, that's the signature of the drawer. No, never. They never do. Never, never, never. But guess what? The banking system, the UCC holds the banks responsible to know its depositor. And as a result, if somebody steals my pack of checks and starts writing checks and forges my name, the bank will be responsible for all of that, not me. As long as I appropriately tell the bank that there are problems. Okay. Moving along in a chapter here so I get the right stuff. All right, forgery and alterations reporting time. A customer must examine with reasonable care and promptness a bank statement and relevant checks that are paid in good faith and sent to the customer by the bank, and must try to discover any unauthorized signature or alteration on the checks. Okay, now, like I said, you don't get the check back anymore. In the old days you did, but nowadays what happens is you get a picture of the check. So your bank statement is going to have more pages to it, but it won't have any physical checks. And on those additional pages to your bank, your checking account, there are going to be the pictures of the check that were taken when it went through the payment system. It's your job to look at your bank statement to make sure that, hey, I wrote that check for $100. Why was it cashed for $1,000? That's a problem. Somebody made a mistake, or somebody is trying to steal from me, or somebody stole checks from me and signed my name to them and put them into the payment system. And it's been, I've had stuff coming out of my account now. Well, what I need to do is I need to tell the bank that something bad is happening, and I have a certain period of time. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, went too far. All right. We're talking about check 21. You have the right to see the original check if they explain the necessity of other stuff. Consumers have 40 calendar days from whichever is later, the delivery of their monthly bank statement or the date on which the substitute check was made available for them for examination or review. So you have 40 days basically after you receive your bank statement. Now, some of you get a paper document in the mail. Some of you get your statement electronically through email. Whatever day that it's determined that your bank statement was made available for you to review, you received your bank statement, you have 40 days to tell the bank that something bad has happened. So it's important that you look at your bank statement to make sure that nobody is stealing from you, that no transactions have been done in error or with inappropriate amounts or something like that. But so you have 40 days after that to do that. All right. The next thing on the list here is consumer funds transfers. Get to there. All right, so we have a few different things out there. We have the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, EFTA, protects customers making electronic transfers of funds, means that any transfer of funds other than the check on paper that is initiated through an electronic terminal, telephone, computer, or magnetic tape that authorizes a financial institution, debit or credit amount. The service available from an automatic teller machine is a common form of electronic transfer. Okay, so we have the EFTA is a federal law which tries to protect you from mishaps going on when money is being moved around electronically. Okay, the most common methods are the ATM. So you go to an automatic teller machine to take out money, put money in, possibly transfer money. You have a pay by phone system, which is authorized by the law, where you can call. I used to do this with my utilities all the time. I would just get my statement. I would then call the electric company and authorize a payment against my account. I've just gotten away from that. I now just have it done automatically. Direct deposit and withdrawal. This is also an electronic movement of money. In the old days, we would receive a paycheck from our employer. That doesn't happen anymore. Almost everybody has direct deposit. So you give your employer your banking account information, the routing number and your account number. And when payday comes, they just electronically put the net check amount into your bank account. Point of sale terminal. This is where I talked about what was going on. If I hand the check to the teller at Walmart and they put it into the machine and it electronically reads the check and then does an electronic withdrawal from my account in order to cover my purchase. Internet banking, we now have access to our accounts to do all kinds of things, to move money around, to pay things, to make deposits. So anything that's done with internet banking is also considered to be under the Electronic Transfer Act. What is your responsibility as a consumer under the Electronic Funds Transfer Act? Well, there's two numbers that are out here. And basically, we're talking about a transaction that has occurred either with your, well, basically what we're talking about is you losing your credit card or losing your debit card. Okay, a consumer who notifies the issuer of an EFT card within 2 days of learning of a loss or theft of the card will be held to a maximum liability of $50 for unauthorized use of the card. Okay, so if you lose your card, notify your bank immediately. Okay, if you do that within 2 days, the maximum under law that they're allowed to charge you is $50. Failure to notify within that time will increase the consumer's loss to a maximum of $500. Okay, so if you miss the 2-day deadline, then your liability moves to $500. If a loss would not have occurred, but the failure of the customer to report it within 60 days, that loss is borne by the consumer. So there's 3 dates here. Within 2 days, $50 maximum. Within after 60 days, after 2 days, but before 60 days, $500. After 60 days, it's unlimited. Okay, so if you lose your card, make an effort to report it to the bank ASAP. All right. Anything else? Okay, that's all I have on there. So give me a second here before we split up for the day. There's one other thing I want to check. I want to check the syllabus because I think we're at a point where that's the end of the first grouping of material, isn't it? Yep, that's the end of the first grouping of material. So that means that on Tuesday, which is going to be in February now, right? February 1st, we will have the first exam in this course. So it's going to be on chapters 27, 28, 29, and 30. I'll put this back here so I can see you guys. Are there any questions about anything that we've gone through? You know, we've been talking about negotiable instruments. We've been talking about the payment system in the United States, how we move wealth around, and actually money. We're specifically talking about money when we're talking about negotiable securities, negotiable instruments, all kinds of laws out there. Remember that the big thing is if you are taking an instrument, you want to be a holder in due course. Okay, a holder in due course has a few requirements. They have to take it in good faith. They have to give value. They have to not know of any notice of dishonor or defenses, and they have to it must not be out of date. If you qualify as a holder in due course, remember you're not going to be subject to the limited defenses. The universal defenses still will get you. You can be a holder in due course through a holder in due course. We talked about the payment system. We talked about liabilities of endorsers. We talked about turning bearer paper, or excuse me, order paper into bearer paper. We also talked about language of negotiability. We talked about the liabilities and warranties of endorsers, secondary responsibilities, so to speak. And this last chapter here, we talked about checks and the money, the collection and payment system as regards to checks and electronic funds transfers. That's a lot. It's 4 chapters, but that was a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? Those of you that that you had me last semester, the exams are going to be identical in form. It's going to be 20, well, as best as I can, close to 25 true false, 25 multiple choice, and then 50 points of the exam will be essays. The essays are where I get you to do some critical thinking. So basically, my idea is to give you a fact situation and then ask you to apply the law that you should have learned over the last 4 classes. So there shouldn't be any surprises. Any questions? Okay, if there's no questions, then that's all I've got for today. And we'll see you on Thursday for the exam.
Are we on Zoom or are we in person?
Probably still remote. Probably still remote.
Wait, so is it on Tuesday or Thursday?
All right, see you Thursday. See you Tuesday.
Professor Gomojak?